Creative Babble.
Criminal Conduct Season 5 is available right now. You can binge the entire series on Patreon and Pretend Plus on Apple Podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Companion. Iris and Josh seem like the perfect match, but when a weekend getaway turns into a nightmare, Iris realizes that things aren't as perfect as they appear. From the creators of Barbarian and the studio that brought you The Notebook comes a twisted tale of modern romance and the sweet satisfaction of revenge. Companion, only in theaters January 31st. Rated R, under 17, not admitted without parent.
This past December, a brand new podcast rocketed past Joe Rogan and Crime Junkies to claim the top spot on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's called The Telepathy Tapes, and it's hosted by Kai Dickens, a documentary filmmaker. Then my inbox started filling up with messages from listeners urging me to check it out. Listeners couldn't believe what they were hearing. Many started the Telepathy Tapes as skeptics, but by the end of the first episode, they were questioning everything. This podcast is so compelling that it turned some of them into actual believers. By the way, if you haven't listened to the Telepathy Tapes podcast yet, don't worry, it is not a prerequisite for this episode, although I think you should check it out for yourself later. Here's the premise. The Telepathy Tapes podcast makes the case that some nonverbal autistic children possess telepathic abilities. The Telepathy Tapes podcast makes the case that some nonverbal autistic children possess telepathic abilities. The series explores a world where children are not only capable of mind-to-mind communication, but they are also tapping into the broader collective consciousness. Let's just say that this podcast exploded all over social media.
I started listening to this new podcast, and it is blowing my mind. It's called The Telepathy Tapes.
Podcast recommendation. If you guys have not heard of the Telepathy Tapes and you know someone with autism or you're autistic yourself, this whole podcast is just mind-blowing and very interesting.
Some of my listeners shared that they too have had similar connections with their children. Other parents of non-speaking children started testing out these techniques at home and posting it on TikTok.
Okay, are you thinking about the number? Are you thinking about it? You know what number it is?
So you gotta really try it, okay? Okay. Ready?
If you get it right, you get a candy.
Which one was it? Good job.
So good.
Good job.
Of course, many questioned what they were listening to on the show, including some in the autistic community.
Calling the actually autistic community, have you been seeing the Telepathy Tapes podcast? It's this podcast that claims that nonverbal autistic people experience telepathy and can read minds.
You can't see this guy's face, but trust me, this TikToker was not buying it. He's just shaking his head. In today's episode, we are going to take a critical view on the Telepathy Tapes podcast. Is it real? Is it junk science? My name is Javier Leyva, and this is Pretend. Stories about real people pretending to be someone else.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Spotify.
Before publishing this episode, I asked my listeners to check out the Telepathy Tapes and tell me what they think. This is John.
The Telepathy Tapes is fascinating to me for a number of reasons. Like, who's to say it's not real? I'm in the middle, like, as far as, like, is this a real thing? Do I believe that these kids are communicating telepathically? Who are we to say they aren't at this point?
Randy had this to say.
Hi, Javier. I'm so glad that you're doing something on the Telepathy Tapes. I've listened to the entire series, and I must admit, I have really mixed feelings about it. After listening to it, I really feel myself torn. I've had a lot of odd experiences in my life, but I hesitate to ever characterize any of them as anything more than possibly coincidence. However, the things that she talks about, and the fact that some of it has seemed to have occurred where there was no one touching the supposed telepathic speaker, I find that intriguing.
And Greg says that the jury is still out.
Hey there, Javier. I started listening to the podcast, and I definitely was a skeptic at first, but I definitely ended up somewhere in the middle. And I mean, I'm open to the idea that there's more to the world than we can understand, but I really need solid scientific proof to fully believe it.
But Kathy Watson wasn't so sure. In fact, she offered this warning.
If it is true, then these autistic kids better watch out, otherwise governments are going to be rounding them up to do all kinds of things. So maybe they shouldn't go public about their skills. Just a thought.
I even got emails warning me not to cover this topic. The person who wrote to me said that the Telepathy Tapes podcast gives a voice to a group who have literally been silenced, and that neurotypical people like myself should tread lightly when it comes to this topic. That this conversation should be centered around autistic voices. And I get it. This is a tough discussion to have, but it is an important one. This show is called Pretend, and it's about deception. And most of the time, that deception is intentional. But oftentimes, we as people have the ability to fool ourselves. Take, for example, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a common mental trap where we convince ourselves that something is true just because it fits what we already believe. And when it comes to the Telepathy Tapes podcast, I kind of sort of started believing it myself. I mean, how can someone who is blindfolded know the exact 3 digits on a number generator that they can't see? And not only that, get it right every single time. There's no doubt the content that the podcast host Kai Dickens presents is compelling. But hearing is not believing because, as it turns out, when you see the video of the experiments Kai Dickens is conducting, you start to realize that she's not giving us a full picture. And more on that in a bit. If Kai Dickens, a documentary filmmaker, wants to turn millions of podcast listeners into believers, she first needs the help from someone who seems credible, a scientist who studies autism. And she found one. That scientist's name is Dr. Diane Hennessy Powell. Dr. Powell started her academic career studying savant skills in autistic children. Savants are people who possess remarkable abilities like photographic memory, extraordinary musical talents, or lightning-fast math skills. But what caught Dr. Powell's attention wasn't typical savant behavior. It was something stranger. She noticed that some nonverbal autistic children seemed to be communicating with their parents in unusual ways that defy logic. Some parents even claimed that their children were reading their minds. This wasn't just a case of memorizing dates or playing Mozart by ear. These children were apparently picking up knowledge they couldn't have possibly learned or observed. Naturally, Dr. Powell was intrigued. Was this phenomenon just a series of flukes? Or was there something more profound about the abilities of non-speaking autistic people that science has just not discovered yet? So, Dr. Powell set out to investigate. She took the scientific route, testing the claims. She designed experiments to rule out chance or deception. One key method involved separating the child from the parent or the teacher, the person they supposedly connected with telepathically. She would place a physical divider between them or have the parent sit a few feet from the child. According to Dr. Powell, some children were still able to point at letters on a board or type messages that matched the parents' thoughts. In one experiment, Dr. Powell generated random numbers or images for a parent to focus on. The nonverbal child would then spell out exactly what the parent was seeing. It sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? Yet, this is data Dr. Powell was collecting, and she knew full well the risk of diving into something as controversial as telepathy. Pursuing this line of research could easily jeopardize her career and her reputation as an academic researcher. But as she explains, the results were just too compelling to ignore. Here's Dr. Powell discussing her findings on the Cosmos and You podcast.
And if the time that they are correct is statistically significant.
Oh, it's like over 95%.
Over 95% of the time?
Yes.
What? These telepathic kids get it right 95% of the time? And that's how the Telepathy Tapes podcast was born. Kai Dickens, a documentarian, listened to this interview with Dr. Powell and immediately got the idea to produce a podcast about this phenomenon. The concept of telepathy, particularly in nonverbal autistic children, was just too tempting. She said she saw an opportunity to tell a story that would change conventional thinking and potentially redefine what we understand about human communication. Right away, she contacted Dr. Powell to see if she was interested in participating in the documentary. She said yes. Dr. Powell agreed and introduced Kai Dickens to one of her research subjects, a 12-year-old non-speaking girl from Mexico named Mia. To put these claims to the test, Kai Dickens flew everyone out to California, determined to conduct her own experiments and document every step of the process. Kai and her crew shot each experiment with 5 different cameras. Now, I'm going to play you a clip from the Telepathy Tapes podcast, strictly for commentary and criticism purposes only.
There's a blindfold on Mia, and she's on the other side of a partition from her mother. I got frustrated with myself when I rewatched this for injecting myself too much in this moment, because I was concerned that if Ileana didn't see the number for long enough, maybe the telepathy wouldn't work. Let her stare at it for just another second, maybe.
Míralo un poquito.
The number that was generated was 698. Dr. Powell has just shown all the cameras in the room, and she shows Ileana. Dr. Powell is putting the iPad face down. We're taking away the partition, and Mia is going to take off her the blindfold, so she can type. Okay. All right, and if she wants to take it off now, she can.
¿Se puede quitar? Pointing at 6.
9, 8. That was it? Very good.
Mia got the answer correct. They did this over and over again. Kai Dickens says that they conducted 20 tests with Mia, and she was correct 100% of the time. Incredible. They conducted even more tests with random numbers and random pictures. One test involved Mia's mom flipping through a book, and Mia was able to spell what her mom was seeing on the letterboard. Kai Dickens, the host, is clearly mind-blown by this. So is everyone else in the room. One cameraman said that he's a skeptic, and after seeing and witnessing Mia in action, he's a believer.
I mean, I wouldn't do it as a skeptic. I'm generally a skeptic in my life for most things. But through seeing this, I can't, it's hard for me to not believe this is authentic. I'm looking at everything. I'm watching her, I'm watching the mom, I'm watching everything. And for me, in my perspective, it's real.
This confirms what Kai Dickens already suspected. Telepathy is real. But she acknowledges that none of the tests that they conducted that day would be accepted by the scientific community. Is it because of the lack of funding for these types of studies, or is there a mass conspiracy in the material science community to rob non-speaking autistic people of their voice? Maybe the answer is much simpler than that. Could it be that these experiments don't pass scientific rigor because there's something missing from their approach? Kai Dickens and her production team went to great lengths to cover every reflective surface. They set up multiple cameras to capture every angle. But Kai Dickens and Dr. Powell missed one crucial step. The one simple little step that could actually prove whether or not these kids are telepathic. And that was never done. The passive listener may have missed it, but I sure didn't. And Kai Dickens and Dr. Powell know exactly which step I'm talking about. Yet they don't reveal it to the audience for several episodes. We'll get into it after the break.
The PC gave us computing power at home, the internet connected us, and mobile let us do it pretty much anywhere. Now generative AI lets us communicate with technology in our own language using our own senses. But figuring it all out when you're living through it is a totally different story. Welcome to Leading the Shift, a new podcast from Microsoft Azure. I'm your host, Susan Ettlinger. In each episode, leaders will share what they're learning to help you navigate all this change with confidence. Please join us. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's Libsyn, ads.com today.
Meet Amy Lutz.
I have 5 children, and my oldest son, Jonah, who just turned 26 about a week ago, is profoundly autistic.
Jonah struggles with social communication and has a significant intellectual disability.
His IQ has been tested at about 40. She does have some language, but not too much. And he has a history of really challenging behaviors, including aggression and self-injurious behaviors that are medically stabilized now. And he's basically always going to require around-the-clock supervision.
Today, Jonah is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, but in the 90s, when he was born, the medical community was just catching up. In fact, the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder wasn't even coined until 1994.
We didn't have any idea. Nobody was really talking about autism that much. And so, he was a very social baby. He was very precocious in terms of his motor skill development.
Amy thought, well, maybe Jonah has a hearing problem. So she took him to get a hearing test.
I came home, my husband, from the pediatrician's appointment, when my husband came home from work, I said, Jonah might be deaf and maybe that's why he's not talking. And Andy just walked over to the TV. We had one of these gigantic TVs that sat on the floor that people used to have in the old days before we hung our TVs on the wall. And Jonah was watching Sesame Street, which, by the way, he still loves today. And Andy just turned off the volume on the Sesame Street, and Jonah took Andy's hand and pushed it up towards the knob. But it was clear that Jonah was distressed that Andy had turned off the sound. And so Andy turns to me and goes, okay, he's not deaf. What next?
It wasn't until Jonah turned 2 years old that he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder.
As Jonah's challenges became more apparent, I started writing more and more about autism, mostly because the autism we were living with at home looked absolutely nothing like the autism I was starting to hear about in the media. This is when we started to see Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory and lots of news coverage of autistic kids who would sing with Katy Perry or kick a field goal and win their high school football game. And I was like, this is not the severe autism we are facing with at home, where Jonah was displaying increasingly aggressive behaviors that were getting harder to manage as he got bigger. a lot of property damage. He had a compulsion to run away from a safe space, but that was terrifying. If we took our eyes off him for a second, he would disappear, and we'd find him like on the busy road that's kind of at the base of the hill that we live on. It's kind of a miracle that he was never run over. And we didn't solve that problem until we put code locks on our doors that we have to enter a code to leave the house or to come in the house. And this was what kind of finally solved the problem. But we were living in a constant state of crisis.
Amy Lutz started writing about her experience with severe autism to help other families who might be struggling with the same issue. She even went back to school and is now a historian of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Amy Lutz is not only a parent of an autistic child, she is also a critic of facilitated communication, the same technique featured on the Telepathy Tapes podcast. In her latest book, titled Chasing the Intact Mind, she offers parents fact-based history lessons about the harm that these pseudoscience techniques pose on people with severe intellectual and developmental disabilities. I wanted to ask Amy, the parent, not the scholar, if she relates to the phenomenon some of these parents claim to experience.
Almost try to divorce your intellectual brain for a second and everything you know now. But like at that time, did you ever feel like you had this connection to your son? Did you have those same feelings that were captured in that podcast?
Yes, of course. So not the telepathy part, but what I call in my book the intact mind, the idea that there's like a brilliant mind inside autistic people who may even appear very disabled. We absolutely believe that. And the reason why for us is because Jonah was hyperlexic as a child, which is that he knew how to read and write and kind of work with numbers without ever being taught. So when he was, 15 months old, he was crawling on the pool table, putting the pool balls in order. He would do his puzzles upside down, the pieces upside down to make it a little more complicated. And he started writing in chalk on the driveway before he could even talk. So when he was about 4, I just will never forget this. He started with writing these giant letter M's on the driveway. And within just like a week or so, that had evolved into writing out scripts from Sesame Street videos. He wasn't being taught any of that. It was easy to believe in that moment that he was a genius. We really did believe that. Now, the sad truth is that hyperlexia is a very precocious ability to decode, and Jonah could still read you anything that you handed to him, any kind of scientific document or the Bible or whatever, but he can't understand the plot in like a simple board book.
Non-speaking autism does not equal intellectual disability. Each individual is unique, and it is so important to avoid generalizing or making assumptions about a person's cognitive abilities based solely on their inability to speak. There are many non-speaking individuals who have gone to achieve remarkable things, but they've done so without relying on controversial methods like telepathy or facilitated communication. Okay, so you've heard me throw the term facilitated communication around once or twice already. For those of you who don't know, facilitated communication is a method to help non-speaking or minimally speaking people communicate using a facilitator. This facilitator, usually the parent, the teacher, or the therapist, supports the person's hand, wrist, or arms to help them point to a letter on a keyboard or a letterboard, or to type on a device. If you haven't already, check out the Netflix documentary Tell Them You Love Me. Tell Them You Love Me is about Anna Stubblefield, a Rutgers University professor who uses facilitated communication with a nonverbal intellectually disabled man referred to as DJ. Through facilitated communication, Stubblefield discovered that DJ was more intelligent than anyone realized. She said that he was a brilliant mind trapped in a disabled body. But the documentary took a twisted turn, and I literally gasped when I realized that Stubblefield and DJ were involved in a romantic relationship. The question is, did DJ consent to having sex with his facilitator? I mean, the whole thing was truly disturbing.
My name is Zaid Jilani, and I have a newsletter at Substack called The American Saga.
Zaid Jilani is a reporter who typically covers politics, but Recently, he's been fascinated with facilitated communication and the telepathy tapes. In fact, he wrote several articles about it on his Substack, The American Saga.
There's a lot of ethical questions about what they're doing because what the scientific consensus and what the critics say is that these techniques don't actually enable these nonverbal people to communicate. What they do is they make them dependent on another person who more or less ventriloquizes them.
So let's get back to the telepathy tapes. When you listen to the experiments conducted by Kai Dickens and Dr. Powell, you are left convinced that these children are telepathic. They offer up no other explanation for the miracles that you're witnessing with your own ears. But hearing, like I said earlier, is not believing, because Kai Dickens points people to her website where you can actually see some of these experiments with your own eyes. The problem is you have to pay $10 to watch the videos. My curiosity got the best of me. And when you see what's actually happening, you realize that Kai Dickens is leaving out a whole lot from her podcast. And watching the telepathy tape experiments on video was nothing like what Kai Dickens sold us. Kai Dickens led us to believe that the non-speaking children in her experiments were pulling random numbers out of their parents' minds, when instead, the facilitator or the parent who already knew the answer was holding a letterboard in the air, guiding the children's finger to the right letter. Another thing I noticed was that the facilitator, usually the mother, would hold the child's forehead or jaw. Could these parents be applying pressure when the child got close to the correct number? Kai Dickens does disclose that some of the parents do this, but she dismisses that the parent is leading the child to the right answer. Here's another thing Kai Dickens doesn't tell you. When the children are spelling on the board, the parent is doing some weird nervous gesture. And not some subtle gesture. I mean, it almost looks like a conductor at an orchestra. One mother moves her wrist as her son is typing on the iPad. She moves her hand down to her lap and quickly raises her wrist to her face. I'm telling you, these movements were so distracting that I actually had trouble keeping my eye on the child. Back to my conversation with Zaid Jilani.
I know you paid the $9 or whatever it was, and I paid the $9 to watch some of these experiments. When I heard it, I mean, that first episode was pretty compelling because Kai, you're not a scientist, right, Zaid? I'm not a scientist.
Nope.
She's not a scientist, but she's conducting these science-like experiments, right? And she has her documentary team film them. And the way she describes it, it almost sounds real, right? And then you watch the video and it's painfully obvious to me and it's painfully obvious to you, but it's pretty convincing if you don't know what you're looking for.
Yeah. So, I think that what Kai does is that first episode maybe is the most compelling in a way because it's the only episode that the host Kai Dickens is not completely bought in or propagandistic on behalf of everything that's happening. She actually is expressing some skepticism, saying, look, we have to really figure out what's going on here. We don't know what's going on here. And so she goes through a process of designing experiments to test the telepathy. Now, one of the really misleading things is that the videos often differ a lot from what's described in the podcast. So the very first child that she meets, whose parent claims that she's telepathic, her name is Mia. And what they do is they do a series of experiments with different things. They will have a random number generator generate a number, right? So you can get an app that just tells you, 242, right? And then that's shown to the mother. The child doesn't see it. And then the child gets an opportunity to spell out whatever the mother saw. That, they also open a book to a page. The mother gets to see a word on that page. The child doesn't see it. And the child gets an opportunity to spell it out. So all that Kai tells us about how Mia is spelling them out is that I think that she says that she has her mother has a finger on her forehead. But if you watch the video, her mother is often doing way more than that. In the test I believe in the test with the book, her mother is holding her entire face with one hand, the entire hand is around her face, around her jaw. And in the other hand is a printed board of letters, right? That the child has to tap to, right? So what that does is it creates a lot of opportunities for the mother to guide the child to the answer. And the mother always knows the answer, right? It's not a very simple test would have been just for the mom and the facilitator to be different people, right? Even if they do believe in facilitated communication, if they do think it's legitimate, they didn't have to know the answer. The person sitting right next to them, touching them, didn't have to know the answer, right? That's one weakness of all their tests.
And that is what is called a double-blind test. In a double-blind setup, the person helping, like the facilitator, wouldn't know what the word or number is, and the researchers observing the experiments wouldn't know either. Only the parent is shown the number, word, or image. The parent could be in another room, focusing on the target while ensuring that there are no other visual or physical signals passed to the participant. If the participant consistently identifies the correct target, then it would support their telepathy claim. But that is not what's happening in the telepathy tapes experiments.
If you're holding the child and you're holding the board, you're creating many different ways to guide someone to the answer. You can tilt the board so that they know where to tap on it. You can tilt her face so that she knows where to look. You can apply pressure when she's getting close, because all these communication techniques, usually what happens is the child is hovering their finger over the board for a second, trying to figure out where to go, and then they tap. Well, all of that presents opportunities for cueing, right? Where you can cue the person where to go. And that's always been the problem with facilitated communication, going back to the 1970s.
If you really want to test if this kind of facilitated communication actually works, there's a test for that too.
Now, all you do with a double-blind test is that you take a pair who is using facilitated communication, a facilitator and a child, and you show them different images. So let's say that I'm a facilitator and there's a child. The child is shown dog. I'm shown cat. But we don't know what each other were shown, right? And then the facilitator goes to the child and says, okay, can you please type for me what you just saw? What happened when they did these tests is that the child would type what the facilitator saw, not what the child saw, right? And the reason why is because the facilitator was the one guiding the child the entire time.
In these types of tests, the child typically types the image seen by the facilitator, not the one that they were shown. This strongly suggests that the communication is being guided, consciously or unconsciously, by the facilitator rather than coming from the child. It took 8 episodes, but eventually Kai Dickens acknowledges the problems with facilitated communication on her podcast. For listeners mesmerized by telepathic kids, learn about this unreliable practice. Facilitated communications are dirty words in the scientific community. So, its proponents have rebranded it under a new name like rapid prompting method or spelling to communicate.
And Kai Dickens, I think, is the latest variation of this, right? She's telling us that everyone's telling these kids that there's nobody in there, that they're not smart. But hey, with spelling, they can do all these things. And hey, actually, it makes them telepathic. She's taking it to another level, right? But if you think about it, she kind of closed the circle, because the advocates for facilitated communication never had a very good explanation as to why children who had never had much of formal education, assessment, could suddenly write book-length essays and, do all this complicated stuff. They just said, well, they just absorbed it over time. They weren't speaking, but they were taking in information. But if Kai's theory is true, it actually offers some justification for what the spelling advocates have said all these years, because she's saying the kids picked up all this information telepathically. My first piece on all this back in October, before the telepathy tapes, but it was about facilitated communication. I spoke to a couple parents who are using facilitated communication or something similar to it. And it was a very difficult conversation in many ways, because I think how a lot of parents and family members feel is that they want their son, daughter, sibling to be at the same level they are, right? And that goes beyond disability, right? I think anyone who's raising kids, like your parents, they want your kid to succeed. They want them to do better in life than they did, right? I think that's always the American ideal, or maybe even the human ideal. And so I think with a lot of these parents, the two that I spoke to in particular, one was a professor at Columbia University who's written several books and is very prolific in media, always doing popular media essays and stuff. And then the other one was a lawyer at the Federal Trade Commission, also very accomplished, right? And very, very smart people. And so for them, I feel like the bar is even higher, right? Like they want their kids to be writing books, right? They want their kids to be like white collar professionals, right? And I think when their kids were diagnosed with nonverbal autism, it must have been extremely crushing for them, right? Because that kind of diagnosis, because it's a cognitive impairment, it's not just a physical impairment. It's not a motor skill issue like what Stephen Hawking had with ALS and so on and so forth. This is actually a cognitive issue. With that kind of situation, it would be almost impossible for them to, be a professor at an Ivy League school, right? Or to be like a top flight lawyer, right? And I think that much of the promise of facilitated communication, prompting methods spelling to communicate, this batch of communications techniques, is that these kids only have a motor function problem, right? Like autism, their theory is that autism is actually a motor disorder. Something is wrong with their body, they have a mind-body disconnect, but that their mind is basically intact and that they can function at basically the same level as anyone else. They can go to college, get the PhDs, be lawyers, blah, blah. And that is a very promising story, I think, to tell a parent like this, because it will assuage a lot of their fears and their trauma, I think, from being in that situation of thinking to themselves, wow, my kid will never reach what I did, right? Now they're thinking my kid will. They have to use these spelling boards to do it, but they can write entire books. They can, one of the mothers is having her son write a memoir. Her son was, I think, diagnosed with I don't remember exactly what the IQ was. Maybe it was around 40 or something, right? And he, you see videos of him. I think he lives a very simple life and he's trying his best. But I don't think he is someone who probably wants to write a memoir, right?
Which gets us back to Amy Lutz and her son, Jonah.
It's still really great that Jonah can spell and type on his own. So he can search on his iPad for the videos he wants to watch, but he's not searching for complicated, Nova specials or things that, political commentary or disability rights documentaries. He's looking for Sesame Street videos, occasionally a Barney video, thrown in there, Richard Scarry video. I think Jonah's a very interesting case for debunking a lot of the claims that are made by proponents of facilitated communication. And Jonah can type on his own. And what he types reflects the kind of things he says, which is he asks for, food or places to go. He always wants to go to the water park. He asks for people. He asks for my sister, who is his favorite person. He says what he doesn't want to do, like he'll say, no, brush teeth or something like that. But he's not, waxing eloquently about what it's like to be trapped in a body that doesn't work, or writing poetry or things like that, which is at this extremely sophisticated level, the kind of output that comes when communication is facilitated.
And why do you think some families are drawn to this idea, or frown upon some of these scientific critiques? Why do you think that they reject that?
Well, I think it's because nothing is more important than the intact mind, right? Like all the things that are part of what you and I would consider part of the good life. That's a term that philosophers use to describe the things that make life meaningful for most people, which would be having a fantastic and interesting job, really rich interpersonal relationships. Maybe it's being able to travel or to engage with politics or philosophy or history, literature. All of these things are predicated on having a kind of at least a typical level of intelligence. And all of these things Jonah will never have access to. He won't ever even be able to just walk out of the house without someone with him because of his complete lack of safety awareness. So he's going to have a life that's very constrained compared to what any of us would choose for ourselves and certainly for our children. I think severe intellectual and disability is a tragedy. Nobody would ever choose that path. That's what parents are responding to. Nobody wants that. And the facilitated communication offers a path to say, you thought all this was denied your child, but no, not really. If you hold the letterboard in front of them, you'll see that they actually are brilliant inside, and it's just a matter of tapping that brilliance. So all those things you thought they would never do, they can do that. So I understand how seductive facilitated communication is to parents who are looking at a pretty desperate future without that.
But Amy told me that she doesn't understand why some parents refuse to test the authenticity of facilitated communication, even though it's easy to test. All you have to do is ask the child to produce information that is unknown to the facilitator.
And really unknown to the facilitator, not something the facilitator could guess or intuit.
Being a parent of a severely intellectual disabled child has exposed Amy to several parents who believe in facilitated communication.
There's a robust, kind of robust spelling to communicate community right where I live. And I was talking to one of the parents and I said, you and your husband both spell with your adult son, it'd be so easy to kind of just confirm that it's really his voice you're hearing. All you'd have to do is, one of you would read a New York Times article with your son while the other one is out of the room, out of the house, whatever, make absolute sure that you can't hear. And then you switch. And if dad read the article with the son, then mom comes in and dad leaves and mom said, what did you read about with dad? And you would see if the son could spell out details about the article from the New York Times, and that would be evidence of independent communication. And she was like, yeah, that would probably work. But she never circled back to me to say that she did that. These facilitated communication communities are really insistent that type of testing is offensive, it is inaccurate. They have a million different reasons why they won't do it. But I just don't understand why given all the evidence, which is overwhelmingly shows facilitator influence to the point that in 3 decades, dozens of controlled studies have documented that in these facilitated situations, it is the facilitator controlling the output and not the disabled person, that parents aren't afraid of hijacking the very limited agency of their children. So you have kids who don't have very much control over their lives, but maybe they are capable of saying, what they want for lunch or what they want to do on a weekend afternoon. And suddenly they're spelling out, don't listen to what I say, or don't pay attention to my behavior. All that matters is what I communicate on the letterboard. And what I want to do on the letterboard is like go to a museum, and what I want to watch is some kind of brainy documentary, not Sesame Street, so suddenly the things that are meaningful to that child and the things they would choose to do are kind of taken away in favor of things that the facilitator imagines that this brilliant, intact mind would choose.
And so, it makes me think that someone would say, well, Amy, this is hopeful, this is positive, but what are some of the dangers of believing in this kind of pseudoscience?
Right. Well, it is very harmful. The biggest harm in that is depriving intellectually disabled people of their own voice. There are kind of less common harms, but very devastating, such as false allegations of sexual abuse, which has happened in dozens of cases. I think there's over 60 documented cases of facilitated spellers who have accused their parents through the letterboard of sexual abuse, which has led to parents being arrested, especially the fathers, these very vulnerable kids being put in foster homes, separated from the people who love them.
I reached out to both Kai Dickens and Dr. Diane Powell. Dr. Powell was the only one to respond. She politely declined to be interviewed. If you want, take a listen to the first episode of the Telepathy Tapes. Then you can listen to part 2 of my critique of the podcast. You might walk away thinking, who cares these parents think that their child is telepathic? Let them believe. But like Amy said, believing comes with a price. In our next episode, we are going to talk about one case where a mother murdered her son because she believed he spelled out that he wanted to die. We're also going to take a deeper look at Dr. Diane Powell and some of her other beliefs. That's next time on Pretend. Part 2 of my Telepathy Tapes critique is available right now on Patreon, on Apple Podcasts, on Pretend Plus. So head on over. You can listen to it ad-free, plus some bonus episodes that I plan to release of things that just didn't make it on the show. Also, I would really love to know what you think. There's still time to send me your thoughts. Send me a voice memo at javier@pretendradio.org. I'll try to include it in part 2 when it's released here. All right, that's it for today. Thank you, and we'll talk to you next week.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today.
Creative Babble.